Welcome to another edition of Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. My name is Jamal Binding. I'm the chair of the board of Movement I'm All for Race Equity, which is a group that deals with racial equity issues, anti-racism, accountability, transparency. The organization's been around for about 10 years. And one of the things that we do is host community forums. We also interview prominent people and people in our community who can share light about various issues related to social justice issues and issues that oftentimes the media does not give in-depth conversation to or opportunities for people to engage and banter about some of those issues of the day. Today, what we have is Jeanie Shoemaker Mezger, is the editor of the Nebraska Criminal Justice Review. I met her through the newspaper years ago, and she's also working with a group called Nebraska Unafraid that attempts to deal with the community, dealing with folks who've been convicted of sexual crimes. Some of the most hideous crimes are murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault, particularly with minors. We'll talk about some of those taboo issues today, what has been done to address and reduce those statistics, and have an honest conversation and discussions about how we arrest those fallacies and eliminate those crazy situations and so on. But Jenny, let's start off by letting you share a little bit more about yourself. We'll get right into the questions.
Okay. So I'm Jeanie Shoemaker Mezger, and I retired a few years ago and found that retirement let me spend all my time working on issues that are really important. And they're issues that I probably wasn't aware of. And then once you see what happens in the criminal justice system and you watch a few people get ground up in it, it's hard not to do something about it. So I started out working with Nebraskans Unafraid, and that's an organization that advocates for people on the sex offense registry. And we try to support people on the registry and their family members. We try to educate the public, and we try to keep the legislature from making things any worse. So that's what that organization does. I'm also involved with the Reentry Alliance of Nebraska, and that brings together people, individuals and organizations that are involved in reentry. And it's a great organization. And then the other thing that takes up a lot of my time is the Nebraska Criminal Justice Review. It's a free quarterly newsletter, and I think of it as a meeting place for ideas on criminal justice. So that's the way I think about it. And so we publish letters from people on the inside of the prisons. We try to give them as much of a voice as we can. And then anybody else that wants to submit something, submissions are always welcome. We've had a hard time fitting all of the submissions in the last several issues. That's a great problem to have, but it's a good problem to have that many people engaged in what's going on in the criminal justice system and wanting to take part in it in a public way.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see, other than that, I think that's it. I don't know what else you need to know about.
I'm going to run through some questions. I'm going to be real quick here. One of the things, I want to get all this in 30 minutes before we open it up to the participants. According to the Nebraska Department of Corrections report, the average daily population prison system is roughly 5,888 individuals. And there's a correction inspector with the Ombudsman's office, Zach, who's recently become an interim in that position. He works with the state ombudsman, and also the Department of Correction has its own chief inspector, Gerald Britton, I think. And my question is, what is your work relationship with both individuals in a sense? Because you do work where you work with folks who are inside the system.
Yeah, let's see. I knew Doug Kobernick was the inspector general for the prison system, and he's been doing that for about 10 years. And Friday was his last day in that position. And so then his assistant, Zach Pluhacek, is now the interim inspector general. And I hope that he becomes the inspector general. So those guys have done a lot of work. They have access to people inside the prisons, the people who are residents there. They have access to staff and they have access to a lot of the information in the system, and they have access to the legislature. In fact, that's who they work for. They work for the legislature. So the other day, he was at Zach, or both of them were at a meeting, and they were explaining that they have access to all of this. They can collect a lot of data. They can examine a lot of things. They can go in and do, I'm not sure how much of an investigation about deaths in prison they can do, but they have all of this access, and they produce reports that are very useful. They give us a lot of information about what's going on in the prisons. But one of the things they said was, we don't have any power. So they can collect all of this information and make it available to the public and to the legislature. And but they can't actually, if I contact them and I say, I know somebody from the inside who contacted me and said, somebody is sick inside and they're not getting the medical care that they should be getting. I can talk to the inspector general about it, but they can't actually go to the prisons and make sure that that person gets medical care. So
One of the things I'm pushing at is, how well do you work with them? In other words, what
oh
you're alluding to is that they're not able to do certain things. And I would challenge both of them or all of them, because I don't think they have a good relationship in our community to help notch them up a bit. But my question is, what's your relationship with both of them, or that office?
yeah, I have a good relationship with them. I've known Doug since he started. And I have talked to them about issues that I've seen in the prisons. I have talked to them about things that are in their reports. They're very responsive. They're very eager to get input about what the public sees going
Gotcha.
on.
Good.
And then the other person you mentioned is actually employed by NDCS, the Nebraska
Department of
Department of
Corrections.
Correctional Services, right? So, and his name is Jeff Britton, and he is the chief inspector for the prison system. So we've got an inspector general who works for
External,
the
internal.
legislature, and then we have a chief inspector who works for the prison system. He works directly for Director Jeffries. And I haven't had any trouble working with him. I have talked to him about issues. He's been able to help me with several things. I think that he has kind of a huge job because he's taken on a lot of the communications with the public, and answers questions that, maybe we used to be able to direct to
Right.
department heads. But I think my impression has been that he takes on those questions and answers them.
Right.
So his job is big, which means responsiveness is, I'm not sure if he is as responsive as he was at the beginning. And it could be that his job has grown and just simply doesn't leave him time.
Well,
Um,
by the way, I contacted him today and he would not agree to do an interview. So, and I say that up front because, again, when you work for the state or public, and again, he's new in the job, I'll give him a little bit of grace. But at some point, need to get in the communities and do that. Jenny, I got a lot of questions I'm gonna get to. And I'm looking at our time and our pace, so I'm gonna have to go through a little bit. I'm gonna
okay.
switch up again. In your organization, one of your goals is to deal with the sex registry law, which does not help and often causes harm. Cite some examples for me.
An example, I talked to a man the other day who, when he was 15, had had sex with his 13-year-old neighbor, girlfriend. I'm not sure what their relationship really was, but they had sex a couple of times. And then, I think when the girl told her mom what had happened, the mom reported the 15-year-old boy to law enforcement. And nothing happened to this kid until he was 18. And then he was arrested, and charged. And since he was 18, they charged him as an adult. And so then I think he pled guilty to lewd and lascivious behavior in a
Mhm.
different state. So in the different state, he pled to something, put him on the registry for, I think, 10 years. So his 10 years, anyhow, in moving around, he ended up in Nebraska. Nebraska's law says if you were on a registry in the state you came from, you have to be on the registry here. And it also says that if you are charged with more than one sexual offense, you are on the registry for lifetime. And they don't care
Wow.
what sexual offenses they are. So lewd and lascivious, this guy had 2 charges of lewd and lascivious behavior. And so he's on the registry for lifetime when he lives in Nebraska. So, and when he lived in Illinois, he wasn't on the registry. If he went back to his home state, he wouldn't be on the registry. But here he is in Nebraska, and he is on the registry for lifetime.
Gotcha.
And the reason he's in Nebraska is because he has children here.
Gotcha.
Otherwise, he would make the choice to live somewhere else.
Gotcha.
So those kind of things happen where somebody who at 15, we all know how wise those decisions we make when we're 13 or 15 or 18 or, in some cases 35 or, 50. But those unwise decisions, I don't think should be laid on somebody so heavily that they pay for it for the rest of their life. And that is what happens with the registry. The Nebraska registry has 3 different durations. So there's people who are on the registry for 15 years, people who are supposed to be on for 25 years, and then there's lifetime. So those are the only 3. None of them, except for the 15-year people, none of them have a chance to get off the registry early. So that means that the older you get, the more forgetful you are, the more forgetful your spouse is, the less mobile you are when you're older. It can be a real problem to number one, remember that April is the month I need to register. And so if you don't go in and report to the sheriff when you are supposed to report to the sheriff, you can be charged with a crime for that.
You can go back to jail there.
You can, yes.
I'm gonna switch up again. I'm sound like I'm pushing, but I really want to
You're
get as
good.
much, and then we can come back to some of the questions later on or the comments. As I review the Department of Corrections Semi-Annual Report 2024-25, the data person individuals know that there are several cases of sexual harassment inside the system. We're talking about people who were inside there, of inmates and so on, with the guards and all that stuff, and inmates. So they said 67%, or basically there was roughly around 42 cases, or 20%. Basically what I'm saying is that there are some cases involving staff, there's cases involving inmates. Okay, they keep track of those numbers, I think, very well. Are those folks who have ever been convicted of sexual deviant behavior? So in other words, can you go behind the prison system, and would they be considered part of the registry if they do something inside the jail or prison, whether it's an inmate or whether it is a guard or something like that?
Once you're in prison, once you are an inmate in the prison, you are treated as if you are a child. So you are treated, a child cannot, by law, cannot consent to sex.
Okay.
So when you are in prison, you're locked up, and you no longer have the ability to, legally, you no longer have the ability to consent to sex. So any sexual contact on the inside, whether it's inmate to inmate or staff to inmate or inmate to staff, no matter who initiates it, no matter who says, yes, I want that, it is considered a crime. Now, they do have a federal law called it's PREA, P-R-E-A, Prison Rape Elimination Act. And that is supposed to set up a process by which someone can report a sexual assault.
Gotcha.
And so, yeah. But we've also had reports that PREA has been weaponized against people who are gay inside the prisons. So if you have 2 inmates who are gay, and if there's any kind of contact between those 2 people, sometimes the staff will report that as a sexual assault, which separates the 2 people. And
I'm lost. Help me with that. Just because you're gay, you get reported. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that some of the staff I have heard that some of the staff do that. Some of the staff are harder on gay people who are in prison. And so when they see, yes, So
Wow.
when you see it, when they see anything that is contact between um,
Same-sex people,
two people
they're
who are
tougher
getting,
and rougher on them. Just like
yeah.
sometimes the same with race. Sometimes those racist guards could be very bad to people of color in our system. One of the things I'm going to ask you, and I know we talked about this earlier, what is the racial makeup of sex offenders who are convicted in Nebraska and serving time? Do you have numbers or anything like that in terms of the numbers or anything?
I have the,
Registry. Is that the same thing? The register and the conviction, they're the same thing. What does that mean?
wait, say that again, Jamal.
What is the racial makeup of sex offenders, and are those sex offenders the same as registered who are convicted in Nebraska? Are those
Yes.
synonyms that I'm using here in a sense? Help me
Yes.
with that.
And then I will say that I don't ever, I try not ever to use the phrase sex offender
Why is that?
because that is a phrase that tends to light people's brains up and they immediately it's been used to frighten people so often that when we hear that phrase, it tends to make people think of the worst thing they could imagine that a person could do.
Okay,
And generally imaginations go a little wild. So I just try to avoid that because I want people to hear what I'm saying and not get distracted and let their imaginations run away with them and
gotcha,
go in an unfortunate direction.
gotcha.
Um, okay, so you were talking about the numbers of
Right.
people.
What are the numbers? You have some numbers here.
So on the registry itself, we have 83% who are 83% of the registry is white,
Mm-hmm.
and 12%, a little over 12% are black.
Okay.
And then they don't break out any ethnicities. So sometimes people have asked me, what about Hispanic people? They don't, the registry does not collect ethnic data. It does collect white, black, American India, Alaska,
Okay.
Asian or Pacific, those kinds of things, but they don't collect the ethnic data.
Gotcha.
But I will say that just going through the registry and seeing all the names on the registry, there are a lot of. I would love to see that number myself. I guess it looks like it would be um, a number out of proportion to its. Uh,
Well, like everything else, unless you got a good lawyer and you got the county attorney and the people public defender
right.
doing a good
So the
job.
12%,
Yeah.
the 12% that on the registry who are black, measure that against the 4% in Nebraska in general population who
Right.
are black. So
Disproportionality.
it's way out of proportion.
Yeah.
Yes.
When I worked at Catholic Charities and I was a senior director there, there was a son of one of our workers who was convicted of having sexual contact with another young person. To make a long story, the grandmother spent a lot of time, the mother spent a lot of time trying to get custody of the grandchild. And what I can summarize, the tragedy happened on her watch, and she was very angry because she wanted that child, but I think it happened on her watch. And my question is, what kind of programs are in place to engage in these conversations since there's a crazy situation in Nebraska? In other words, I heard only the story from one side, and I know things like this happen, but is there anybody out there that helps that help us deal with those situations as tragic as they are to do the healing process? And I know your organization, Nebraska Unafraid, deals with advocacy in the prison system, but are there groups out there can help us deal with dysfunctional or crazy things that make people whole again?
I would love to see the restorative justice people get there to be involved in this kind of conversation because they are the ones who are able to bring two sides of a story together to prepare both sides to come together to talk. I've heard really encouraging stories about people that do that. I don't know of anybody in Nebraska that does restorative justice with
Wow.
people on the registry. But I think that would be an excellent use of restorative justice to be able to bring people together and say, why did you do this? And this is what I was thinking when I did it. I think that would be really helpful. There's so many sex offenses that happen within a family. And instead of tearing a family apart, I think it would be really good if we did have a way to bring a conversation in and talk about how did this happen and why did it happen and let people say what they need to say to each other in a safe and I
Right.
don't want to say controlled way, but in a safe way.
A healthy way. By
Yeah.
the way, there was restorative groups back in the day.
There are restorative justice
Yeah,
groups in
Minnesota
Omaha
was known
or
20
in
years ago,
Nebraska.
20 years ago. So I know there are some groups, but I haven't heard much
Mhm.
about them.
Yeah,
There's a national,
Jim Jones was the one that kind of started it, I think, in Nebraska with his his group called
he's out of Lincoln,
Community.
right?
I can't remember what it community.
Yeah, I don't.
Sorry, I
Yeah,
can't
I
remember.
don't know much about it. I just met him a couple of times. There's a national organization called Sex with Boys is another official name for them, and many would call it a perverted organization. How rampant is sexual assault in our state, our community? Do you know anything about that? Because I don't know if that organization exists here, but I know nationally there's some groups have been advocating some stuff like that on the internet.
Yeah,
So
that group has a terrible reputation, and I don't know very much about it except that I've never heard anybody say to me, I belong to that
in
organization.
Nebraska,
I've
okay,
never heard anybody anywhere say that.
gotcha,
And as far as I do know that there are some groups out there. There's one group called Virtuous Pedophile, and it is an online group because of necessity. Those people need to maintain their anonymity. But it is a group that is designed and intended to help them um, find a way to live their life without indulging in their sexual attractions.
gotcha. Many years ago, I shared this before in one of my classes, but many years ago, Senator Chambers raised concern about potential law that the senators were proposing to pass a law regarding child pornography. Senator Chambers used an example of quadriplegic, where the person has no control of their limbs, but has a stick that they have in their mouth that they can go to the computer, whatever, and they go to a child porn site on the internet. And what he was saying, he was pushbacking against the law that if someone looks at that site and not able to do anything, should they go to prison? And again, over the years, I've shared that conversation in the classroom with different people, and some of the students literally lost their mind. They couldn't even talk about it. But they were saying the fact that you look at it, you can't do nothing. You ain't got no arms and legs. You should go to prison. And again, it's like freedom of thought, not freedom of speech. And my question is, do we consider such crime as murder or terrible crimes that if someone looks at a site, they can go to jail or prison for so many years? And I find that weird or strange. And that's what Ernie was arguing in a sense when he was pushing back at some of those state senators saying it's one thing if somebody can carry out a crime, but if someone is incapable, why would you give them the same time for what their eyes see? And I'm throwing that out kind of weird way to you, but should we consider that in that same level? Again, I might be putting you on the spot by asking that question too, but that's what we do.
Well, if you look at the numbers of people who've been convicted of child porn, um, possession, distribution, those crimes, it's huge. It's just a huge number. And the reason is that it is probably the easiest crime to commit. So you click a link and an image comes up on your computer, and although you don't know it, your computer saves a copy of that image. So now you possess that image, even though all you're going to do is look at it. But because you're looking at it on a computer and your computer holds on to the cache for what you've looked at, it still has it. So you possess it, and then and it's also the easiest crime to find out. When law enforcement discovers a website that is distributing or displaying illegal images, all if they can take over that website, then all they have to do is what they do is they run it for a few weeks so that they can gather information about the users. So they run it for a few weeks and then they open up the web logs and they can say, oh, look at all these IP addresses. Now we know who to go get. And so when they do find a website, take it over, that's what happens. And you'll see big clumps of arrests, at the same time because they all
Wow.
get pulled out of that same website.
Wow. What I find is fascinating is that years ago, I don't, when we first started with Cox Cable and some of those cable systems, we didn't always have our computers locked down. And my neighbor, who's an IT person, said, "No, you got to have a security in that because he said somebody can go and put it on there, And again, I wouldn't put it past some of the crazy stuff in our society of some of these individuals doing that who may dislike you politically, or you're involved in social justice and you push it against something like on the national level. And I can see the mentality level of somebody with a CIA mind or FBI mind doing that. Again, I'm of that conspiracy theory that happens. But again, we only got a few minutes left, and I'm gonna make sure we open up the right time. When I was a
Okay.
member of family and friends of inmates, there was an incident where a state trooper having sexual relationship with a minor, I assume was a teenager, and he was convicted and he was serving time. And one of the things that blew my mind, at least that made me kind of strange, is one of the inmates cracked his skull in the prison. Again, he's already serving time, and they were talking about in this meeting. It was under Bob Halston's watch, and again, they did nothing about it. I guess the guy didn't report the people who cracked his skull, almost killed him. And we hear people talk about this double jeopardy in prison. If you commit a crime against a kid or certain things, they can do stuff to you, other inmates, and it's kind of encouraged sometimes. And my question is, should those cases be subject to outside intervention when guards condone such behavior? And we know they do in our national and even local system or in our state. It's a general question.
Yeah, I think that when somebody cracks somebody's skull, they should be charged with assault. I mean, that is what it is. And so, but the thing about prison is that whatever happens in prison is generally invisible to the outside. And so, in some places, with some people who work for the prison system, they are able to convince themselves that it's okay to ignore something that happens to a particularly despised kind of category of inmate.
Hmm.
And so, yes, it's very dangerous to be convicted of a sex crime and then go to prison. And there's people who put themselves in protective custody right away because they fear for their lives.
Wow.
So yes, and it is the prison's responsibility to keep them safe.
Yeah.
It's the state's responsibility to keep them safe. And when the state does not do that, then we should all be upset about that, because if the state can do it to those people, they can do it to anybody.
Right.
And we need to remember that.
Some years ago, one of my neighbors was convicted of a sexual crime. He had to move out of his house because our home is close to a public school. And subsequently, he moved back into that home. What are the rules regarding how to deal with folks who have served their time for sexual crime, particularly with a minor? In other words, you just alluded to, Jeannie, earlier that sometime is lifetime, but at some point, should he be able to move back to his home? In other words, do we ban people from schools in Nebraska, or how's that handled? I'm not sure of it.
Nebraska sets up a law that says if a town wants to have a residence restriction, it can only be 500 feet, up to 500 feet. It can only apply to schools and or child care facilities, and it can only apply to people who have been convicted of an aggravated crime against a minor. So, and I can't remember what they call it, dangerous sex offender. I can't remember. They have a specific phrase that they use, but it does not apply to everyone on the registry. So most people on the registry are not prevented from living next door to a
Oh,
school or
okay.
whatever. Yeah, so that's a concern, and there's a lot of, say, landlords who think, they misunderstand the law and they think that 500 applies, the 500 feet applies to everybody. It does not apply to everybody.
One of the questions we ask our guests oftentimes, how do you measure outcome, success, or significant accomplishment in your group? And you got like three different programs you alluded to. And so my question is, how do you know if you're doing a good job or your groups are being effective or your work?
Um, everybody that we talk to, everybody that calls Nebraskans Unafraid and says, I need help with such and such, all of the stories are different. So it's really hard to collect data and say, I was able to successfully help this person. I had a person call me today, and he is facing a mental health board hearing, and I don't know if I will be able to help him at all. But the biggest help that, and I said that to him, and he said, but you listen to me, So the thing is that people who are maybe facing a lot of isolation on the outside of prison, sometimes that isolation is really, really hard. And so to find a place where you can go and talk about your situation, even if even if the group can't solve your situation, you still have somebody that you can talk to who understands what what happened and why it's a terrible thing to be yelled at by your neighbor across the fence, for example, simply because you were convicted of something, maybe even something terrible long time ago, but you have served your time and you should be able to come back to the community without having to be left so vulnerable with your face and your address out there on a website where everybody can see it and can access. There have been murders because of somebody having their name and picture on the registry. And that's back in 2020, there were 2 men in Nebraska that were killed. And one of them was very definitely because of the registry. And the other one was almost certainly because of the registry.
Yeah, we're at our halfway point, but I just want to make a comment here. I know that back in the day when I used to attend 360 meetings, the mall police department used to collect people's names and sometimes their relatives of gang members, and we asked the question in the meeting, do they ever get off? Especially if it's a cousin or somebody who's associated with their brother, or whatever. And they had no answer. It's almost like once they got on the registry, they didn't know how to take them off. Then I know the Department of Helpless and Hopeless Services is notorious for putting people on certain registry and they make them go through hoops and stuff to try to get them off, even if they've satisfied some of the things. And so they almost have to get a lawyer to fight the department when they've even been misjudged or somebody misreported them. So it's been some crazy stuff in our state because of functionaries not necessarily know how to engage our community, know how to let people become whole and healed. As we use the word restitution or restorative justice, where you can heal and go from that. We're right at our point, and as you know, I'm OCD when it comes to the time. So, folks, at this point, you can ask Jeannie any questions, comments, reactions, things I said, she said, but mostly what she said because she's the so look, throw your comments and question to her. And also, if you want to put something in the chat. By the way, go
I
ahead.
have a question for
Sure,
you.
go ahead.
And I know you and I've had a lot of conversations, but something you said confuses me. So back to that story of the 15-year-old boy, and as a man, he was sentenced to, he was convicted, and he was required to stay on the registry the rest of his life. If he were to move to Nebraska, which has the 10, 15, 25, would he still be required to be on the registry for life, even though he's in Nebraska? Does it change?
So the story is a little backwards. So in his home state where he was convicted, he had a 10-year duration on the registry.
Okay.
So he did his 10 years, and then he happened to move to Nebraska. Nebraska said, "Oh, you were on the registry in your home state, so you have to be on the registry here, and you were convicted of 2 counts of something, which means you have to be on for lifetime." Nebraska's laws, like most laws, I think, the more I watch the legislature, the more I think they're really terrible at writing make sense. They love to create a law that they want to be able to say, I protected the community. I was all about community safety. And so they pass a law. Well, the law always has to do with after the crime has been committed. So if we make a law that says, you cannot do XYZ, you're not arrested, nothing happens to you until you've done XYZ. So it's not a preventive measure. And so your question was what? Did I miss your question?
So if somebody who is, well, in this case, was on the registry and then moved to Nebraska, how did Nebraska know if he had already completed his 10 years?
I think I might have the story mixed up too. He was supposed to be on it for 10 years in another state. And then I think he moved here when he was still on the registry. I'm not sure how they track that down. If somebody moves into the state from a different state, how does Nebraska know that they used to be on the registry? Or
yeah, that and the other part you answered, if they had a tenure in one place, but they moved to a different state that has different statutes, then the state number 2 statutes apply, even though the crime was committed or the offense was committed in state number 1.
Wow.
So moving around can really be detrimental.
Right. Yeah.
but it could be beneficial if they were in a state where it said you're on for life, and they moved to another state, said, oh, in our state it's only 15 years, then it would be advantageous to leave the state that requires life. I mean, am I understanding that?
Yeah,
It's very,
all of there's 50 states, all of them have a registry and all of them treat it differently.
Wow.
So there's similarities among a lot of states, and then there's just little details that are different. So people that are thinking about moving to different states have to be very, very careful about what will happen to them in another state.
You got another question coming in. How does the system balance public safety with rehabilitation, Jeanie?
Well,
That's a different.
public safety.
answering the question.
I have heard so many people say that, the school principals say that their first priority is public safety. Legislators say that their first priority is public safety. The governor says his first priority is public safety. I'm like, come on now. Surely the education department should be worried about education first before, you know what I mean? There's so much talk about public safety, and in all of that talk about public safety, we have convinced people that we're all terribly unsafe, and we're not. The crime rate right now is very, very low, much lower than it was in the 70s when we were all staying out until the streetlights came on. So when they talk about public safety, I just kind of ignore it because I don't think they're really talking about public safety. Usually what they're talking about is, can we create another law?
Wow.
And you talked about rehabilitation. Rehabilitation, they don't care about that. People can go, for decades without another crime. I talked to a man today who said his only encounter with law enforcement before he was arrested for a sex crime was a speeding ticket. And I hear that all the time, that people who generally lead very, very sedate lives, very law-abiding lives, do something out of character and commit a crime, a sex crime. And so after they've committed their crime, they very, very rarely reoffend with another sex crime. If the registry makes life so difficult that they end up very poor because they can't find the job that they used to have, they end up taking a job that pays far less. If you're trying to feed your family, it's not too big of a jump to think that stealing something from the grocery store is going to feed your family. So you can end up with another kind of crime, but it's not generally another sex crime. Gotcha. So rehabilitation happens, and rehabilitation happens regularly. I know people who've been on the registry for decades without any further encounters with law enforcement, and yet they aren't considered. Nobody will recognize that they have rehabilitated themselves. And so they are still subject to all of those laws that have been put in place to control the movements of people on the registry. And they are laws that if a person not on the registry doesn't have to tell the sheriff that he's leaving town for more than 3 days. That's crazy, right? But people on the registry have to tell the sheriff that they're leaving town for more than 3 days. So, and they also have to tell the sheriff when they have a new car or when they sold their old car. And if they...
You making this up? Are you serious? In Nebraska,
oh, no,
have a law like that?
No, it's very serious. Yeah. And if they don't do that, if they don't report the things they are supposed to report, if they don't, it can be a crime and they can end up back in prison for that.
Wow.
So
it's crazy.
And these are all crimes that the general public can't, they're not crimes for anybody except for people on the registry.
Wow. As you were talking, and it kind of hit me as you were talking, if you're on a sex registry. In other words, once you come out of prison, is there something that when the police officers stop you for a ticket, they can see if they look it up, is it available to all law enforcement if you've been on a registry? How did you know that?
I'm not a law enforcement officer. I don't know what they have access to, but I think they have access to the information that somebody they stop They go back and they run your driver's license.
Right.
I'm sure that it comes up that this person is on the registry.
Okay. That's wow.
If we have any law enforcement officers among the audience, I'd like to know the answer
Well,
to
no,
that. But I'm pretty sure
they don't come on my show. This is the holy sanctuary area. They don't deal with me well. Okay. Other question. There's something else somebody has in the chat here, and it goes, how do the public know and public because of the levels? I'm a little confused here. In other words, how would the public know this stuff, what you're talking about? And then what are the levels or something like that? Because you got different things you kept saying today earlier that most people wouldn't know about. How do you know
So
the different levels?
when people in Nebraska are on the registry, they are on for either 15 years, 25 years, or lifetime. So those are the basic divisions. If you come in from another state, you might do 30 years or 10 years, or I don't know how they figure all of that out. But if you're convicted in Nebraska, those are the three: 15, 25, and lifetime. And the way they decide which one you are, they look at your crime and any possible punishment for that crime. So if it's possible to punish somebody for over a year in prison, they will be on for 25 years.
Okay, that's how you serve. So the question also someone's asked is, how do you consider the seriousness of the crime? So, for example, if a person is 21 and the person's 18 and you have sex with them, they're technically a minor, whatever. Is that the same as a person having sex with a 15-year-old or 10? So the question is almost saying is, how do you know which is more serious than the others? You follow me?
Mhm.
Because you just got through talking about years, but I'm saying, and I assume this is something the judges does or when they go there, but is there some kind of rule or line or bar graph that they use to determine certain kind of offenses
Well,
like murder?
it is hard to tell how serious a crime was because, for instance, if okay, let's go back to the 15 and 13-year-old. So he's on for lifetime here in Nebraska, and if you look at it, he's how old is he now? Let's say he's 43 now. You look at his registry, and it'll say that his victim was a minor. So you're looking at a 43-year-old man. And you're thinking, oh, a 43-year-old man had sex with a minor or with a child. And so the older he gets, the worse his record looks because they don't include all of that detail. This happened when he was, you can probably do a little math and figure it out, but it's hard to know how serious the crime was. Because they don't distinguish. Everybody on the registry gets treated the same way. Some get treated that way for longer than others, but everybody on the registry gets treated the same way.
Wow. What's unfortunate, and I might have shared this at some point, but when I worked in an organization, child welfare, there was a woman in Bellevue who was a foster parent, and she had sex or intercourse more than once, I guess, with her foster kid. And one of my colleagues predicted she would not see a day in jail because she's a white woman. The guy was a young African American guy. And the question was, that happens based on how your judge is or how they deal with that. So there could be disparities between how you get sentenced and who's you judge, lawyer. You got the public pretender, and if the county attorney is very aggressive. So there's one of those concerns that people have in our state is that sometimes these laws and issues are not interpreted well, depending on who if you got some good connections to make it happen or not happen. So that's one of the issues we need to have more public discourse. There's another question coming in at you. What drew you into this type of work or compel you to work with the population of this people yourself?
I think most people get involved with this because they know somebody and they watch them go through that. They watched a family go through that. So yeah, that's how I got into it. I watched, and then I met more people that were on the registry and I watched what happened to them. You watch somebody who is on the registry and doing very well, and you look up to him and you say, wow, that's the role model. That's the one that everybody should try and be like that guy because he's doing very well. He had a good job. He had relationship. He had, he just looked like things were great. But all it took was for him to lose his job. And not because the company folded. It wasn't like he lost his job. The company folded and then he needed to find another job. So he's thrown out there into the job search world. And in the job search world, it's very difficult for people on the registry to find work. So he was out there again. He lost his apartment. He'd already lost the job, of course. The girlfriend disappeared and he ended up living back with his parents in their basement. He was glad to have the parents. There wasn't a problem with that. But it's a lot to handle when you are, you watch everybody else around you who doesn't have to deal with those kinds of denials when you are looking for a job. I know of a young man who got a job at a restaurant here in Omaha just recently, doing very well, loved his job, was, he was very excited to have this job. And then they found out he was on the registry after he'd been there a month or more. And he lost his job at that point.
Wow.
So, and that happens a lot where people who are on the registry, they're trying to find a job out there. They will go, they'll interview, everything's hunky-dory. They'll get the job offer, and then HR will do the background check. And actually for background checks, you don't even need to do a background check to find out that somebody's on the registry. But it's very common for people to get a job offer and then have the offer rescinded. So there's a lot of, it's just emotionally, it's very difficult for people when they are job hunting.
There's a question in the chat here that says, are you aware of any anti-discrimination registry laws in any states?
No, because people on the registry are not a protected category. So you can't discriminate against people because of their race, and I'll get the list all wrong, but I think you all know what I mean. You can't discriminate because of race or religion or
National
ethnicity.
origins, right? And
I can't remember what else is in there, but you can discriminate against people who are on the registry, and that's what the registry does. It sets up a list. It says, here's a list of dangerous people, and if there weren't a list of dangerous people, we may not ever know what they did. But now we have a list of dangerous people, and the community is encouraged to discriminate against them. Discriminate against them by not renting to them, by not hiring them, by not, associating with them. Churches will turn people away when they find out that they are on the registry. Not every church, but I've heard so many stories about churches. And I hear stories from Christians, so it's a lot of churches that I've heard about. I don't know about other religions, other faiths.
When you say Christians, you mean they tell you inside the church what they do because they're inside the church? You say you hear them from Christians. What does that mean?
Well, I just mean that I'm not picking on churches. I'm just saying instead of like synagogues and mosques, I'm just saying,
okay,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. I'm just saying most of the stories that I've heard have been about churches. So yeah, so people who go to church, and church is important to them, maybe because they've been through prison, and a lot of people find a deep faith there, and they come out and they want to be in a place that's all about forgiveness and
redemption,
mercy and grace.
Right.
And when somebody in the church finds out that there is somebody on the registry among them, oftentimes they are sent, they are told not to come back. I shouldn't say often. Sometimes they will allow the person to attend church, but they will need to sign in, or they will need to have a chaperone while they're in church. Some churches won't let them.
Nebraska?
Some of the churches won't let them use the restrooms. So what did you say?
You're talking about here?
I'm talking about Omaha. Yeah. Oh. I'm talking about Christians.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I met a few of them. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
May I add something to that?
Yeah.
I had to have a discussion with a leadership group at a church, and they were concerned that people on the registry were coming into their church. And I did some research, and I was blown away to find that 1 in 24 adults in Nebraska are on the registry. It is that there are so many people on the registry for all these increasingly list of crimes that now are sex offenses, 1 in 24. I said, it doesn't matter what group you have. If you have 100 people, statistically, you have 100 people at church on Sunday. 4 of them are on the registry. Do you know which 4 they are?
Wow.
Well, no, there are members. Well,
Wow.
so this perception that people are on the registry that you don't know are dangerous, and everybody in your congregation, this is my editorial, the people in your congregation that you know, obviously they couldn't be on the registry because they're all nice people.
Right.
And another thing too is that the people you're sitting next to in church or at work or at the movies may not be on the registry, but they may be the ones that are offending against someone else. And you just don't know that yet.
One question came to mind, and I must commend the Department of Corrections. They got one of the best Facebook pages ever. Their Facebook page is so good. I feel like I want to go and move in that hotel because they do just a marvelous job in propagating themselves and propaganda and all that. But my question somewhat is, if someone is inside the system who is convicted of a sex offense that we were talking about, do they get counseling, and do we have something called chemical castration in Nebraska? Because I've heard people talk about it on the national level or in movies and so on, but I don't have a clue what goes on in Nebraska. Or is there something like that can help people out when they get inside to help them to get healed in a sense?
Well, in prisons, some of the prisons have programs, sex offender treatment programs is what they call them. But my view is that any kind of therapy that's given in prison is essentially coercive. Because if you have a therapist and you have an inmate, there's an imbalance there, and the therapist has all the power. And so I'm always really wary of people who are forced to go through therapy when they are in prison.
They're being forced to. I got you. I hear what you say.
I've also heard from people who say that the therapy that they went through in prison was really, really helpful. So I know that it's possible, but I also know that it is possible that it's just a coercive practice.
Do we have chemical castration in Nebraska?
Not that I know of. I know that right now, I think there's been some states that have implemented that kind of really atrocious. I mean, when you think about it, what are we doing to people? Yeah, I just shake my head at that because that is so inhumane. I know that I have heard where someone requested, I'm not even sure what chemical castration means, but this person requested something that would reduce his sex drive, I guess. Is that somebody?
Right,
There's
right.
an expert out there who believes, but the idea of a court sentencing somebody to that, or no, that's so reprehensible. I just can't think that we would treat human beings like that.
Right.
It goes back to oh shoot, I can't remember where it was, but they used to sterilize, they used to sterilize people who were mentally handicapped. That used to be a practice where they would do that. And I think that homosexuals used to also come under some of that kind of treatment. Anyhow, it is not something that we need to be returning to. So
we're almost at the end of the show, but there's a question jumped out here. It says, in the therapy groups that are in the sentence, they oftentimes happen many years after they're in the system or something, and people do not remember the significant details. In other words, there's one thing to do the serve therapy aspect when you go in. There's another thing you do at the very end and sometime or whatever, but it's a timing on that whole issue. But I don't know how effective they are. And I didn't, like you alluded to, Jeannie, I don't know the outcomes or anything.
Well, sometimes they're effective, sometimes they're not. But usually when people get out of prison, they are mandated to complete some sort of a treatment program, even if they took treatment while they were inside the prison. So mandated treatment is like, it's like mandated drug treatment. It's probably not going to be very effective. What's going to be effective is somebody realizing that what they did was really wrong,
right,
and deciding not to do it anymore.
Right.
And therapy may help some people do that, but I sure would like to see them working with a therapist that they pay, that is responsible to them, and they would have some, instead of their parole officers or somebody deciding what kind of therapy is required. So, and I've heard of people who go to therapy and they end up in group therapy with people who have done very, very different kinds of crimes from theirs. And sometimes, I remember a mother telling me that her son was horrified when he went to a group therapy thing because his crime was like having, I don't even remember what his crime was, but it was one of those things that we're all kind of like, is that really going to put somebody on the registry? But in his therapy group, he was hearing these horrifying stories about, from somebody else in the group that was describing his own crime. And there's some kind of twisted things that we do when we're trying to control people with a really heavy hand and then pretend that it makes anybody safer.
Right. We're down to the last few minutes, but I wanted to ask a question. If someone wanted to catch up with you or be a part of those groups, how would they do that? Because you mentioned 3 different organizations that you work with, and I suspect they're all support groups or groups that will help to make the system better or somewhere. But how would they catch up with you, or what's your contact information that you can share?
Well, let me see here. I've got Nebraskans Unafraid contact information. I meant to have this all put out together. Okay, so Nebraskans.
Go ahead.
Um,
No, I was
let
going to
me.
say we have evaluation also too, but go ahead.
Okay. So to call Nebraskans Unafraid, you just call 402-403-9250. I would type it, and put it in the chat, but my keyboard is wonky and I think it has cat hair in there, so it won't. Anyway, but you can go out and look at nebraskansunafraid.org and get the contact information there. And I apologize, I should have had this already for
We
you.
can make it available later through our website.
Okay, good. Thank you. And then the Nebraska Criminal Justice Review newsletter, if you want to subscribe to that, we'll make that information available also, right?
Okay.
Okay, cool.
By the way, and Delia, one of the persons says that evaluation require approval access or something. So we may have to put that out or send it to people via email if they register or something like that. But one of the goals is we would like to have our programs evaluated. And also what we want to do is bring more people into the circle, like Jeannie, who has such wonderful information that's traditionally not covered in the local media. And again, I'm a lifelong resident, 71 years old, and been living in this state all my life. And I'm amazed at the dismal level of how journalism and public conversation and dialogue doesn't deal with some of these sensitive issues. And so it's nice when you have somebody who can come and be very honest about stuff and have an honest discussion to help improve our system, because we cannot expect functionaries and people who benefit off a system to enter some of these conversations. So I really appreciate you, Jeannie, being here. But anyway, we will make sure we can get the evaluations to folks. And if you want to contact us directly through our number, 402-212-7083, or email us, and we'll make sure you get that evaluation. And the other thing with that is we're always trying to look for cutting edge things that we can bring these things on the local level. Right now, as a country and as a society, as a state, we got some dysfunctional, dismal things going on. And a lot of people are very frustrated. And again, one of the ways we want to address that is having relationships, dialogues, and bringing these different programs to the forefront. Because again, as Jenny alluded to, some of these organizations are small organizations, they don't get a lot of funding, and they're trying to do the best they can to make our community better than what it is. So I really appreciate you, Jenny, for being here today, and of course, all of my guests. Anything else you may have for us, feel free to contact us at moreomaha.com. And also, the other thing we want to do is we want to be able to deal with race issues and class issues, because again, we see the universities moving away from some of those things that are very important to who we are. And so someone has to stand up and be the town crier and challenge system. And who better do that than some of us who are retired and those who are older, who's got a lot of this knowledge. So on that note, I'd like to thank you for being here tonight. Again, next week, we're going to have a conversation talking about the police department and their overspending budget and their 3 helicopters. And Riley, one of our former board members, is going to talk about that. And then we also going to have a book discussion a couple of weeks from that with Karen Abrams, one of my colleagues on the board. We're going to talk about fascism in Russia. but the book is so well written, this book discussion, it relates to what's going on here in the United States. And so we believe not only just more than freedom of speech, but freedom of thought. So hope you join in and give us other suggestions, enter these conversations, and help us to make our community better than we found it. And on that note, we always end by saying, may the force be with you, Barocco.
Thank you.